All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Spookcast. I actually have no idea what I'm doing. I am simply winging it, so don't roast me too hard in the comments. Okay, just kidding. Please do roast me because that will actually drive engagement. Okay, so before I start the first segment of the podcast, I want to let my audience from previous videos know that I will be engaging with some comments on my last few videos, and I will put that in the end of the podcast. You can skip to it though if you want. And it kind of even makes sense for newbies to stay and listen because it's a perfect introduction to this podcast too, because it will give all 12 of you the opportunity to get to know the content that I make and my positions on the topics I discuss, with the two most requested and engaged with topics being modern psychology and leftism. These seem to be highly debated topics, and I need you to understand my angle before you get mad at me, because I don't want to end up getting all sad and start crying in the shower while listening to How to Disappear Completely by Radiohead on repeat. Okay, let's get this whole thing going. So the first step will be to look at a spook of the week. This is what this segment is called. And what I mean by that is we're going to look at what's happening in the world, and we're going to pick out a specific spooky event or occurrence and then talk about the spooky elements of that specific thing. So in the first segment, I'm going to look at that. And then in the second segment, which is going to be called Dissecting the Spook, we're then going to look at the deeper roots of that specific spook and try to deconstruct it a bit. Okay, and then we will go over to the next segment, which is called Living Ownness, which will be about practical approaches from a Stirnerian or egoist or whatever you want to call it perspective. And I'm going to try to collect spooks for this that plague people, that bother people, and then discuss them. And I already did this for this segment. By the way, if you want me to discuss a specific spook, you can submit your request if you are a member of the Patreon or YouTube, that is. But if you can't afford that, it's cool. Just shoot me an email and I will think about it. Also, you can vote weekly on the topics that are discussed here as well. I didn't do it for this one, but I will do it for the upcoming ones. And you don't have to be a member for that. So you just have to subscribe to the Patreon as a free member or subscribe on YouTube, and then you can vote. Okay, so let's get this thing started. The first segment is and will, for the foreseeable future, be called Spook of the Week. So I figured a good topic for the Spook of the Week segment would be to look at what's happening in Germany right now with the recent election results. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then we're going to talk about democracy in general. So what happened in Germany? In case you don't know, I'm going to kind of tell you about it a little bit. So we had our federal elections here recently because the previous government fell apart, or rather the coalition fell apart, which led to the second election. In case you don't know anything about German politics, let me explain just briefly everything you need to know. So Germany's political landscape is a bit of a dance with several major players vying for power. So there's the conservative CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, the SPD, which is the Social Democrats, and then the Greens, and of course the AfD. I will tell you a little bit more about the AfD in a minute. The AfD though is at the moment kind of like the uninvited guest who keeps showing up to the party and now somehow has massive seats at the table. I'll tell you how massive it is actually. It's now 20%. So let's talk about the overall results. So previously we had a chancellor from the SPD, which is the Social Democratic Party of Germany. His name is Olaf Scholz. But shit went down, and in the new elections, the SPD got absolutely crushed. They scored their worst result in decades with just 16.4% of the vote. And, that's actually a huge blow to the party and probably to Olaf Scholz's ego. It's also probably relevant to say that the voter turnout has been the most since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So since the reunification, it has not been this high. It's at 83% right now. On the flip side, there's the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, which is led by a dude named Friedrich Merz, and they came out on top. They won 28.5% of the vote. But even with that, they still couldn't secure a clear majority. So that means that they still have to form a coalition, of course. And the problem with forming a new coalition in Germany is that the election results have created a landscape that is really fragmented. So coming to an agreement is going to be difficult. So in Germany, the standard practice is to form a coalition with other parties to secure the majority needed in the Bundestag or the parliament. The issue, though, is that the CDU's potential coalition partners are not exactly eager or easy to work with. So again, we have the SPD that honestly are a non-starter for any CDU-led coalition after their poor performance of 16.4% and the fact that they were the party in power during the previous term. So there's little incentive for the CDU to partner with a party that has just suffered a major defeat and isn't particularly keen on giving up power again. Then there's the Greens. So while the CDU has worked with them in the past in some regional governments, there are deep ideological differences between the two parties. So the CDU is much more conservative, especially on issues like energy policy. So they may align on some issues, but it's unlikely they'll agree on key areas like the economy or climate policy especially. And at this point, the AfD is still seen as pretty much extremists, so nobody's going to form a coalition with them. But this is going to be difficult. So if they don't come to an agreement, then we might have to figure this out again. But what all of this means is that while the CDU won the most votes, right, they are left in a difficult position because they need to find a partner or partners to form a majority. The need for compromise and negotiation is obviously intense, and it's made even harder by the ideological differences between the main parties. So this fragmentation and the rise of the right in Germany is causing some pretty crazy political instability at the moment, and if no party can form a workable coalition quickly, then it could lead to prolonged negotiations and temporary governments or even another election. But I want to talk a little bit more about the issue with the AfD and what that means about the political polarization that's happening right now in Germany and, all over the world. But let's use Germany as an example. So let me talk a little bit about the AfD if you don't really know about them. So the AfD was founded in 2013, so it's relatively new for political standards. And it was basically at the time an anti-Euro party. So it was reacting to the European financial crisis and Germany's financial bailouts of the struggling Eurozone countries. So initially it was a small niche party that gained support mostly from those critical of the EU's monetary policies. And the party's founders were economists and I think academics mostly, and many of them kind of were reacting to the financial strain of bailing out countries like Greece. But in the years that followed, the AfD kind of shifted its focus away from economic issues to a more nationalistic and anti-immigration rhetoric. And this shift coincided with the 2015 migrant situation, which was a time when Germany allowed over 1 million refugees and migrants, mainly from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, to enter Germany. So in a way, the AfD inserted itself in this narrative, mainly because there was growing fears and discontent with Chancellor Angela Merkel and her what was called the open door policy toward refugees. Then by I think 17, like 2 years later, the AfD had pretty much positioned itself as a far-right nationalist party. So they were talking about shit like German guilt over Nazi stuff and promoting a vision of German identity that was like low-key all about ethnic nationalism. They focused on ideas like Germany for Germans, quote unquote, and their rhetoric became like increasingly populist. I would also say that it was accelerated by the increasing polarization of the political discourse in Germany. So like the mainstream parties like the CDU, the SPD, and the Greens kind of failed to address many of the concerns of German people, especially when it came to progressive values and shit, and having a problem with progressive values. And I mean, look at it now. Like, people were shocked back in 2017 when they had, I think it was like 12% or 13% of the vote, and now they got fucking 20.8%. I mean, that's crazy. Okay, so to think about this spook, I want to think about two things from a Stirnerian or egoist or whatever the fuck you want to call it perspective. So first, I want to kind of critique the entire point of political coalition building and what that actually means in terms of Stirner saying that rulers are inherently egoistic. So how does that even make sense, what they're doing with coalitions? Then the second angle is to look at the fragmentation that's currently happening and think in Stirnerian terms about why this is happening. And overall, this is basically going to be a critique of democracy as a concept. All right. Obviously, for Stirner, democracy is a spook, right? So it's an ingrained and socially constructed ideal that claims to represent the will of the people, but ultimately seeks to suppress the individual in favor of a collective good. So in his view, democracy, like any other ideology or system, is a mask for power, which kind of sells the idea of individuality when actually we are all co-opted by a larger collective entity that really doesn't serve us. But here's the thing and the fundamental argument. Like, Stirner was really explicit in his rejection of this us, right? The people, as a legitimate source of power. So the idea isn't just that democracy is unfair for various reasons, it's also straight up against the individual. So a way to look at it is to look at the fragmentation in Germany's political landscape and the mess it's causing with coalition building. So on the surface, democracy promises that there's a diversity of voices, right? There's the CDU, the SPD, the Greens, the AfD, there's the Left Party, and so forth. They all supposedly represent different interests, which gives voters the illusion of choice. But I think what the fragmentation actually represents is a diversion in the mechanism of control. Having these safeguards to supposedly ensure that no one party can ever truly dominate is actually a way to avoid large-scale revolutionary processes that could potentially much more authentically represent what people actually want. And of course, what they should want is constantly fed to them, right? So because the information people consume is curated and nowadays guided by algorithms to reinforce specific views and fears and whatever, realities are constructed in which certain issues and ideologies are normalized. So for instance, the way the AfD is portrayed in the German media, which is often as an extremist right-wing threat, this creates a specific lens through which people see not just that party, but the entire political landscape. So the media doesn't just present the AfD's policies or actions objectively, right? Politicians seem to kind of use rhetoric in a way that almost insults people's intelligence. Like, there are so many exaggerations and simplified answers or generalizations or whatever, things like that. And I think above all, this builds identities where people see themselves as, quote unquote, anti this or that, or pro this or that, or whatever, which kind of ends up just causing people to give responsibility to something outside of themselves. So it's like people stop engaging with free thought and become identitarian. And this isn't any different for mainstream parties like the SPD or CDU that are also presented in ways that normalize their role in the political system. And in their case, it's like the media and politicians promote them as the center or the mainstream or like the reasonable ones and frame them as the ones who are, capable of making responsible choices. So the main issue, in my opinion, is the encouragement to step away from personal responsibility over one's own life, thoughts, behavior, etc. To just let oneself be guided by these systems which kind of conveniently give us an identity and send us on our merry way. And I think above all that the main point of Stirner's thought is exactly that. So the core issue, I think, and maybe Stirner would agree, is the surrender of personal responsibility in a democratic setting. So we're encouraged to let ourselves be guided by these spooks or by systems that promise us identity and meaning, but at the expense of our autonomy. So by investing in these collective ideologies, we lose the ability to think freely and to critique the systems that govern us, and ultimately to assert our own individuality. So while the political circus in Germany probably seems like a moment of instability, it's also a perfect example of the way power works under the guise of choice and democracy. So the more fragmented the system gets, the more entrenched these spooks become, and the harder it is for anyone to break free from them. So in my opinion, ultimately the message of Stirner is that none of this matters. The real issue isn't who wins the election, it's how the systems behind these political games suppress your ability to think and act for yourself. And that, my friends, is the spook of the week. So for the next segment, I want to look deeper into this spook by thinking about it to its core with the help of some other philosophers. This segment is called Dissecting the Spook. Okay, so we talked about the illusion of democracy and the political fragmentation in Germany and how Stirner would see all of this just as probably another mask for power. But now I want to take this a little bit further. If we really strip this thing down to its core, what's actually going on here? What's the root mechanism that keeps these spooks alive and kicking and successful and happy and all that jazz? Well, first of all, I want to talk about Stirner's issue with the concept of higher causes or causes in general. So what Stirner essentially does in his work is he shows that causes and people who engage with causes are essentially themselves egoistic, while actually framing what they're doing as a cause. So the nation's cause, he gives this example of the nation. The nation's cause is to preserve the nation, right? Not the individuals within it. Then there's the famous example of the Sultan. So a Sultan who claims to be selflessly devoted to his people is in reality serving his own egoism because he sees himself as inseparable from his people. So he expects them to remain subordinate to him. Okay, so if an individual tries to separate from the Sultan's cause and assert their own independence, then they are punished. So therefore, this is an egoistic endeavor. I'm actually going to read this part to you real quick. So he says, "But only look at that Sultan who cares so lovingly for his people. Is he not pure unselfishness itself? And does he not hourly sacrifice himself for his people? Oh yes, for his people. Just try it. Show yourself not as his, but as your own. For breaking away from his egoism, you will take a trip to jail. The Sultan has set his cause on nothing but himself. He is to himself all in all. He is to himself the only one, and tolerates nobody who would dare not to be of his people. That makes me think of that song by the Vandals. I'm trying to look it up right now. Anarchy Burger, where he says, what is the line? Let me see. America stands for freedom, but if you think you're free, try walking into a deli and urinating on the cheese. So Stirner basically suggests that serving any cause other than one's own is kind of self-denial or a submission to some like alien authority that extracts an individual's energy and life without giving anything back. So essentially we are told that power is given to us through democracy, when in reality it's taken from us because we're stripped of all real relationships we could possibly have to our own agency. This is something that I think Foucault talked about in a way that made it really easy for me to understand at the time. So I'm going to share that with you. So he talked about how democracy, rather than being this like neutral system that represents the people, is actually a sophisticated apparatus of control. Not in the sense that there's some secret like cabal pulling the strings. I mean, there probably is, but that's besides the point. But in the sense that power isn't just about who's in charge. It's about the entire network of norms, institutions, and discourses that shape what's even considered like possible. So take the election results we just talked about. The CDU, SPD, Greens, and AFD aren't just parties, they're like crystallizations of different ideological positions that have been deemed quote-unquote acceptable within the structure of German politics. And they create the framework of choice, right? So no matter what you pick, you're still playing by the rules of the system. This is what Foucault calls governmentality. So the way in which power structures don't just repress, but actually produce subjects who willingly conform to them. But this goes even deeper when we bring in the psyche, because remember, I totally think that Stirner was like the forerunner of psychoanalysis. Anyways, Lacan would be the guy who tells us why people keep falling for this bullshit. So this, in a Lacanian sense, comes down to desire, right? People don't just engage with politics rationally. They are driven by unconscious desires or by fantasies or by fears that shape their understanding of reality. So when people vote or when they define themselves as anti this or pro this or whatever, they aren't just making logical choices, they're identifying with certain symbolic structures that give them a sense of meaning and a sense of identity. So the political system doesn't just tell people what to do, it tells them who they are, and it encourages them to choose an identity. And that's why even when democracy fails and even when people get disillusioned, they don't step back and reject the whole thing. Instead, they just try to fix it, to find new ways to make this system that's in place work. So it's a cycle of desire and frustration that keeps the spook alive. And then, of course, there's the aspect of how people are being pulled in through spectacle, like sensationalism and shit. So if the political system is about manufacturing consent, then the media is the perfect tool to do it. And nowadays, media is such a broad term because it's guided by all kinds of new shit and like low-key hidden forces like algorithms. So like I mentioned before, the way the AFD is portrayed isn't just about reporting the news, it's about framing the narrative in a way that reinforces the existing power structures. The same goes for mainstream parties also, by the way. The spectacle isn't just entertainment, it's a way of organizing perception itself so that people stay locked into the game even when they think they're resisting it. So at the end of the day, what we're looking at isn't just an election, and I think it's important to look at the entire thing. It's a machine, it's a whole machine designed to capture people's thoughts, emotions, and identities. So democracy doesn't necessarily just impose rules, it actually creates subjects who seemingly willingly participate in their own subjugation because frankly they don't really know any better. And that, more than anything, is what keeps the spook alive. Okay, so I think that was enough political blah blah for today. I'm gonna go over to the next segment, which is about more practical things like how to deal with these spooks that exist in our lives. Okay, the fundamental question is about agency when it comes to, practical egoism. So how can I foster agency? How can I think for myself? How do I even know that what I'm thinking is actually my own? I posted on YouTube asking people to tell me what their most nagging spooks are, and we had a few different ones. The two top ones were the first one was from Tatiana Whitaker, which was, I'm just going to quote it, "I'm still a work in progress. Recognizing the spook is one thing. Letting the attachment to them go is another. So many years of socialization isn't easy to overcome, but I'm working on it." The second one was by The Annoying Ryan, who said, "Being unique and authentic. My life has to be a movie or else it's not worth it. And it is making me push away things I do love because they don't fit with the narrative I want to have." I think these two are the main ones that I would like to discuss in this particular episode. So let's talk about the first comment first. And I would like to think mostly about this idea of progress, or being a work in progress. So I guess a practical egoist approach here would be to just say, don't treat yourself as a project, right? That is endlessly incomplete. You're not a work in progress. You are just you. You are already your own right now in this moment. So the idea that you have to overcome something or that you have to work towards something implies an external standard of success that could very well be a spook. So that would be my first advice, to look at that. So instead of trying to let go of attachments in some, idealized way, maybe ask yourself, what do I gain from those ideals? Right? What do they serve in me? If something still holds weight, it's because it does something for you, and that's important to own that, right? Play with it, see if it serves your interests, or if it's just dead weight. And the more you see things as tools rather than chains, the easier it is to drop what no longer benefits you without the guilt or the struggle. So again, a Stirnerian approach to this would be to reject the notion that you are a work in progress, right? Progress toward what? Where are you trying to get? Is this ideal a perfected version of yourself that exists somewhere in the abstract? And if so, try to look at it as a spook. So recognizing spooks is one thing, yes, but the idea that you have to struggle to let go of them suggests that they still have a claim over you. And this is the difficulty with spooks. This is why Stirner talks about things like rebellion, and how rebellion is a good example for how spooks can creep in on you even though you have a positive intention. So a spook only holds power insofar as you treat it as something that is external to you and something that has to be fought. But why battle with shadows, right? Why not just have the shadows? So Stirner would tell you that, I'm assuming, okay, but Stirner would tell you that rather than seeking to overcome your attachments, you should probably ask yourself, what do I gain from them? What do they serve in me? If a particular belief or attachment is still lingering in you, it's because it does something for you, and that's something worth exploring, right? But now I want to go segue into the next comment, because I said earlier in my advice here that the more you see things as tools rather than chains, the easier it is to drop the things that don't benefit you. But I want to look at that because it can go into the other extreme as well. And this is kind of the other comment. So what this person is bringing up is something really interesting. It's the spook of authenticity, right? So this idea that you have to be completely unique and that your life has to be some kind of cinematic masterpiece, and otherwise it's not real or meaningful. And ironically, this obsession with being authentic ends up making you feel the opposite. So it makes you second guess yourself. It makes you reject things that you actually enjoy, and it constantly makes you compare yourself to some imaginary ideal. And I think part of this is what people now would call main character energy. It's like this mindset where you see yourself as the protagonist of like some grand narrative, and everything around you exists as a set dressing of your personal journey. So it's not just about wanting to feel special, it's also about structuring reality as if you are the sole subject and everything else is an object orbiting you. And this is something that I've heard so many times. I've heard people talk about Stirner being a solipsist, Stirner being a hedonist, and so forth. And this is kind of what I want to talk about now. So this point where you structure reality as if you are the sole subject, this is where the fundamental disconnect happens. Because by framing the world in this way, you don't actually experience it in any sense of fullness. Instead of engaging with life as something dynamic or intersubjective, where you and others like mutually shape each other, you reduce everything to how it serves your plot, right? Friends become like side characters, relationships are, toys of pleasure or plot devices, experiences become aesthetic rather than real, and like anything that doesn't fit the narrative feels meaningless. Now, this is where Stirner is often misunderstood. If you were to read like a surface level reading of Stirner, it would make you think that what he's talking about with his egoism is embracing this exact kind of thing, this main character energy, where the egoist dominates the world and bends it to their will. But that is not it at all, in my humble opinion. Stirner's Ownness isn't about making the world your personal movie. It's about realizing that all these narratives, all these fixed ideas of self and purpose and whatever else are spooks. And that these spooks are gonna try to like hit you. They're gonna try to come at you, and you're gonna have to be ready for that. So the main character mindset is still, even if it doesn't feel that way, a total servitude, right? Because it makes you live according to an ideal rather than simply living. So it traps you in the very structure you think you're breaking free from. This is where existentialism is super useful, in my opinion, because it can help make sense of Stirner's point. So like people like Sartre and Heidegger argued that we don't exist in a vacuum, so we're always being with others. So that what this means is that meaning isn't some pre-written destiny we fulfill, and it's also not something we impose onto the world. It actually emerges in the like in between, in our interactions, or like in the flux of existence itself. So when you try to script your life as a linear and self-contained journey, you actually cut yourself off from that kind of intersubjectivity, and you become alienated from the actual reality of being. So what does it mean to live Ownness instead of falling into the spook of main character energy? Well, I gotta be real. I kind of really suck at giving advice. I don't suck at it, but like I'm very hesitant to give advice. I don't like it. I feel like I could potentially create a new spook. Like I could get entangled with someone else's fucking karma or something. But I'm gonna just try to put my big girl hat on and try to do it for the sake of the podcast. I'm still gonna be very careful about the advice I give. So here are some things that I would suggest to help with the spook of authenticity. First of all, the belief that your life has to follow a grand linear storyline is, of course, itself a cage, but it's one that you set for yourself, right? By not engaging with the people around you. Because if you did, you would actually probably learn that you are not as important as you make yourself out to be in your own head. And I think this is like one of the most liberating things that you could ever experience. So in this experience, you kind of learn that, well, you're kind of nothing, right? You're kind of nothing without the communications and the sort of exchange with the people that you engage with. And this is also how you keep the dialectic going and how you keep yourself open to new things. And the more you let go of the script, right, the more you actually own, important word here, your experience instead of outsourcing it to an ideal. And maybe that's like really scary at first because like, oh no, what if the spooks come after me? But ultimately try to listen to Stirner when he says his famous quote, which I'm going to paraphrase because I don't know it exactly, but I am not nothing in the sense of emptiness, but I'm the creative nothing, the nothing out of which I myself as creator create everything. And this might be a little out there, but I want to kind of tell you about how I kind of figured it out for myself, which I'm like a visual learner, so I think of things in terms of like images and patterns. And the way that I looked at it was like as if life is like a video game, right? So you have in this video game the person that has created the video game for you to play, and then there's you, and you are like the little avatar that walks around like on a mission, or I don't know, shooting Nazis or whatever it is that you like to do. And then there's all the people around you in the video game, which are, you know, considered like NPCs or whatever, or maybe the people that you do interact with, that you choose to interact with. And in this metaphor, the way that I look at it is that you are pretty much all three aspects of that video game. Like you are the person that has created the game, which I guess you could consider something like a higher power, like a god, whatever, who created the simulation in which you exist or in which you move, but you are controlled by that. And not only are you controlled by that entity that has created the simulation and put you in the center of that creation, but you are also controlled by that entity's desire, right? So this desire, which stems from essentially like not having something and needing to create a simulation for the sake of experience. You are controlled by that person's own limitation in terms of desire, so by that person's psyche, essentially. So this you, which you perceive yourself to be, is actually just a representation of the limitation of existence itself. So your experience or your position within the experience is the position of nothingness. It's the position of something that exists in a space that is supposed to be. Like somebody put you there. Something put you there so that you can like exist and engage. And this desire that is driving the thing that is creating you essentially is a desire to produce meaning, right? To produce some kind of meaning through experience. And I have found that the more I let myself be controlled by that desire, the more, or the less I'm critical of that desire, the more I tend to use my environment as tools, right? So the less I am able to connect with the world, and the less I'm able to connect with the person driving my, position in reality. And ultimately what I feel, and I think this is kind of what Stirner's thought is about, is that this, in between this vessel, like this thing, that this avatar that exists as like a experience, like an observer within the simulation, is kind of like, that's a fucked position to be in. And like, I feel personally like, fuck you, like I am here and I get to fucking do the things that, as much as I possibly can, I can own, you know what I mean? So the point of that position is to try as much as possible to own your position in that experience. And again, take this with a grain of salt, because this is literally just a thought experiment, but this is how, like, this is the kind of like imagery that has helped me understand what I'm feeling in that sense. So this is another way of saying, open yourself up to your own position as nothing, and then go from there. Also, something else you could do is really, really go for empathy. Not sympathy, not some fake ass virtue shit, but real empathy. So like to see others as subjects, not side characters. Being the main character makes you experience others as objects, right? As props, as something that adds or detracts from your journey. But ownness does not mean solipsism. It actually means engagement. And I kind of think that engaging with others on the basis of empathy will ultimately also help you connect with your own uniqueness. And this is where Stirner's egoism and existentialism hit at something so much deeper. If your life is a narrative, then like who is it for? Are you really the one living it, or are you just trying to fit yourself into some kind of structure? Because the moment you start thinking, my life has to mean something, my choices have to reflect my true self, my experiences have to be authentic, you're already lost in an ideal. You're living for an image. You're serving a spook, and you are disconnecting from everything around you. So when you see life as your story, other people start becoming props. And again, this is where that disconnection happens, because instead of experiencing other people as subjects, like you're all subjects, you start reducing them to objects. And this isn't just keeping you from them, it's also keeping you from your ownership of yourself. Instead of being in the moment with somebody fully present and open, or even being in the moment by yourself, you're already thinking about how any kind of interaction, even interacting with yourself, the things that you tell yourself in your own head, fits into some kind of narrative. So instead of actually listening or actually engaging, you're thinking about what this means for your identity. And this is what Sartre called bad faith. Like when you deceive yourself about your own freedom by hiding behind a role, that is called bad faith, right? You're not really engaging with the world, you're just acting out a part. And ironically, this is where a lot of people misread Stirner. They think that egoism means treating the world like your personal playground and bending everything to your will. But you can't bend something to your will if you're engaging with spooks. So Stirner's whole point is that spooks own you precisely when you let them define your life. So this is where empathy comes in. And to look at this more closely, let's go back to the metaphor. Because why are you here? In the metaphor, why are you here? You're here as this fucking slave of some lonely, desperate entity deprived of experience who created an entire simulation just to feel something, right? It created this world for you to be in and do its bidding. And in this world, there are all these supposed NPCs walking around and these predetermined interactions or even just predetermined characters that you are supposed to engage with. So you treating these others as objects, as NPCs, and only serving the fucking mission is just you doing what the person who created the simulation wants out of a sense of desperation. But what happens when you choose to claim your ownness as the creative nothing? And remember, you are a creative nothing because you are now capable to create your own narrative, is you become your own. And you do so by owning the experience you are forced into. You're deciding and choosing what things mean to you. And that is the epitome of Max Stirner's egoism. And that's what ownness is, essentially. It's stepping outside of the roles that you've assigned yourself or that have been assigned to you. And it's about letting go of the idea that life is actually a structured linear arc. And it's about like embracing the messy and unpredictable or non-linear reality of experience. So ultimately you just gotta like be, and this in itself is a defiance to the spook of authenticity. I think in Stirnerian terms, we could like differentiate between being a self and being an owning self. So your identity isn't something pre-existing that you need to live up to, is something that you can mold and use. something that you can play with, and you can discard it when it stops serving you. Okay, I hope that made sense. So for the last main segment, which is called The Spotlight, I want to explore a book I read recently, which is called Stirner and Nihilism by Tom Dowdall. This actually fits very well with this point in relation to what I just discussed in the previous segment. So let's talk about the book. In this book, Dowdall outlines the complexities of Stirner's philosophy and its often misunderstood relationship with nihilism. So Stirner is widely regarded as a radical individualist, but obviously has been misinterpreted as a nihilist and many, many other things. And this is what Dowdall examines. So first, let's talk about structure. So first, we have the introduction, which is titled Stirner, Sinner or Saint. This is where the book sets the stage by sort of discussing the critical reception of Stirner, and it touches on the myths that surround his name. So the question is basically is Stirner the epitome of nihilism, or is there something more to his philosophy? Then chapter 1 is called The Origins of Disrepute, Stirner in Context. Here the text kind of positions Stirner within the historical and philosophical context of his time and kind of helps the reader understand the environment that shaped his ideas. Then in chapter 2, which is titled The Meaning of Nothing, Nihilism's Complex Etymology, the text digs into the term nihilism itself, which is really important and helpful in understanding the subsequent arguments. Then in chapter 3, The Tragic Age for Europe, Nihilism from Nietzsche to Now, the text explores the broader history of nihilism in Europe, what historical aspects have led to this, and it connects Stirner's work to that of Nietzsche and beyond, while also looking at how nihilism evolved throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Then in chapter 4, which is titled The Use and Abuse of Nihilism, Stirner Under Fire, the text kind of tackles all the really harsh criticisms that Stirner has received from Marx and Engels, and how their attacks actually contributed to Stirner being unfairly labeled as a nihilist in the traditional sense. So this is actually a very fascinating chapter. Then in chapter 5, which is titled The State of Denial, Stirner and Political Nihilism, the text examines Stirner's relationship with political nihilism, and it shows that despite his radical critique of the state, Stirner was actually so far from advocating for a political void or chaos whatsoever. Then in chapter 6, which is called The Absence of Absolutes, Stirner and Moral Nihilism, we're kind of getting a little bit closer to what Stirner's actually doing. This chapter explores Stirner's rejection of absolute moral values and kind of brings us to the heart of Stirner's critique of conventional morality and how his approach aligns with moral nihilism, or the denial of ethical standards, universal ethical standards. Then in chapter 7, this chapter is called The Fear of Nothing, Stirner and Existential Nihilism. Obviously, it goes into existential dimensions of Stirner's work, and it kind of tries to find parallels between his ideas and the existentialists who followed him, particularly in terms of the fear of nothing that comes with the rejection of external values. And then, of course, we got a conclusion, which is titled Stirner, the Happy Nihilist? And of course, in this part, there's a reflection on Stirner's potential to embody something like a happy version of nihilism, and one that embraces freedom from all external authority, but not succumbing to despair or apathy. So I'm going to give a brief summary of the main arguments that I've come across so far, and then I'm going to discuss it a little bit further. Let's do it. So the first important aspects brought up in the text is, of course, Stirner's relationship to nihilism. So one of the core arguments is that Stirner's philosophy should not be reduced to nihilism. It's that, like, nihilism as it's traditionally understood is the rejection of meaning, value, or purpose in life, and this has been tied to figures like Nietzsche and existentialists, or some existentialists. But to label Stirner a nihilist, whether as a political, moral, or existential nihilist, is actually to misread his ideas. This is the idea of the book. So at the heart of Stirner's philosophy is the rejection of the abstract, right? The abstract oppressive ideals that control human thought and behavior. But this, in Stirner's thought, is not a void. It's not like a descent into meaningless existence. In fact, Stirner's rejection of external authorities and moral systems is not an invitation to nihilism, according to this text. It's actually a call for personal freedom, self-empowerment, and individual ownership of one's life. Remember what I talked about in the previous segment. So in this light, the text claims that his philosophy is more dynamic and more focused on liberation than the empty, disenchanted vision that's often associated with nihilism. The second argument is that there's a misconception of associating Stirner's thought with political nihilism, particularly in the Russian context of the mid-19th century. So political nihilism, as it was understood in Russia, called for the destruction of political authority, but without a clear vision of what should follow. And it was often violent and revolutionary. But Stirner's philosophy isn't about political destruction for destruction's sake. The text states that he does reject the state and hierarchical systems, but his focus is not on violent rebellion or revolution. It's focused on the liberation of the individual from societal structures and moral obligations. And the kind of anarchism that is explored by Stirnerian thought is not about chaos or dismantling structures, but just about deconstructing and freeing the individual from external control. So from what he calls specters that limit personal freedom in this text. So it's a philosophy that's actually rooted in self-ownership and the recognition that each person should be free to shape their own destiny, independent of imposed systems of power, and not political chaos. Then the text discusses the issue of moral nihilism and kind of explores Stirner's ethical perspective. So the text explains that there's a closer connection between Stirner's thought and moral nihilism than anything else. So Stirner's rejection of Sittlichkeit, like the Kantian concept, which is like the ethical systems that dictate notions of right and wrong, aligns with moral nihilism. So Stirner dismantles the traditional concept of good and evil and asserts that these notions are not universal truths, but rather relative expressions of personal preferences and social conditioning. But to call Stirner a moral nihilist is still to focus only on one facet of his thought. So moral nihilism is more of an inevitable consequence of his rejection of absolute moral standards, but it doesn't actually define his entire worldview. So Stirner's ethics is far more nuanced than this. The text explains that it allows for personal values to emerge freely based on individual needs and desires, rather than adhering to externally imposed rules. So it's a more liberating approach to ethics that rejects fixed moral frameworks that enable individuals to live according to their own principles. Then the probably most significant misinterpretation that is presented in the text of Stirner is his association with existential nihilism. So existential nihilism suggests that life has no inherent meaning, purpose, or value. And like many existentialists like Sartre argue that individuals have to confront this lack of meaning and create their own values. But the text presents it like this. While Stirner's philosophy shares some characteristics with existentialism, like the focus on individual freedom and self-determination, it can't be fully equated with existential nihilism. So Stirner's vision is not one of despair or absence of purpose. It actually offers a positive and affirming outlook on human existence. So Stirner encourages individuals to embrace their uniqueness and their ego and to live a life based on their own desires and needs and not the dictates of an external moral system. His philosophy is presented as one that does not lead to resignation or meaninglessness. So, okay, and then the last argument that is made is about the myth of nihilism and Stirner's, basically, what is presented as his true philosophy. So, the label nihilism, when applied to Stirner, is the entire point. Does it fit? Does it not fit? In the conclusion, the text suggests that the word nihilism could, in the future, undergo a redefinition. If it were to shed its negative connotations, perhaps a new and more positive form of nihilism, which Dowdall presents as mythological nihilism, if this were coined, then it would reflect Stirner's approach. But in the meantime, Stirner cannot be called a nihilist. So in the perspective presented in the text, Stirner should be viewed as more of like an iconoclastic demythologizer. So a thinker who challenges the spooks, myths, and systems that constrain human potential. So let's talk about it. I largely agree with the arguments presented in the text, and to be honest, I am so glad that this misinterpretation of Stirner as a nihilist is challenged in such a thorough way. The book does a really good job of dismantling the assumption that Stirner's rejection of absolute values is a mere negation, like a philosophical dead end leading to nothingness. Okay, I really appreciate that. But what I do want to challenge is the idea that we can reconcile Stirner's philosophy with what is called in the text a more positive or mythological nihilism. And this is where I think the analysis, despite its strength, still operates within a framework that Stirner himself would have dismantled. So to attach even a reconstructed form of nihilism to Stirner seems like another attempt to slot his philosophy into a kind of pre-existing category rather than engaging with its actual implications. Because, think about it, if there's one thing that Stirner does relentlessly, it's the destruction of labels. He's not an anarchist, he's not an existentialist, he's not a nihilist, at least not in the traditional sense. He's not even an individualist in the way modern libertarian or egoist discourses try to claim him. So Stirner rejects all ideological banners because they are, at their core, spooks or phantoms that demand loyalty and devotion, but they don't give anything in return. So to call Stirner a nihilist, even in a positive light, is to place him under a category that seeks to define him by an abstraction. So this is where the text's attempt to rehabilitate nihilism as a useful term is going to end up falling into the same trap that others have fallen into when discussing Stirner. So I absolutely love this book. I would recommend it to everybody who's into Stirner. However, I don't think it needs a conclusion, to be honest. I don't think it does. I think just presenting the arguments in themselves is perfect. It's great. It's absolutely great. Okay, friends, I have been babbling for what feels like an eternity, and I'm kind of running out of energy, so I want to kind of end it here to, in the end, then lead over to the various critiques that I got on my recent videos. So if you're not bored yet, please let me do my announcements real quick, and then stay for the last part. So first, I want to quickly encourage you guys to let me know if you like this, if it works for you, if you think this is fucking stupid, if you want me to change anything, and whatever other feedback you may have. Also, I want to let you know that I am planning to include a segment soon called Unique Voices, which will open a space for people who have some shit to say, and maybe we can do interviews or whatever. If you are interested in that, please, again, shoot me an email and we can talk about it. I also want to take a brief second to remind you of the ways that you can support the channel, the podcast, the project, and so forth. If you would like to join the project, which includes all of the work we do to build a network for people who are into Stirner, which includes our e-zine, the library, the podcast, and more, please have a look at recurringparadox.com for how you can become part of the network. If you are a reader and you would like to support the e-zine or my personal Substack, you can subscribe there as well. Another way of supporting us is, of course, to use your own network by sharing, liking, commenting, as well as giving us feedback and letting us know how we can make this project even better. And guys, we also have a store where we sell merch for the channel and the podcast and the magazine and so forth. So if you're into letting the world know you're into Stirner, which, to be honest, is actually a way that I have managed to meet other people who are into Stirner, believe it or not, then check out the store. The links are in the description. Don't forget also, we have the e-zine and the newsletter, which offer reviews, personal essays, short analyses, research, thought experiments, and more on Stirner and his work and its relevance to contemporary society. We're always looking for submissions, so please feel free to submit your work or pitch something to me or whatever works for you. I would love to hear what you have to say and offer. All right, so if you're still here, amazing. Let me just make my statements here really quickly about the feedback that I have received. I am going to start with leftism. I've received a lot of comments on that are kind of questioning my approach, so let's go talk about it. So my approach to Stirner's thought is post-structuralist with a cultural theory angle. I am not a political philosopher or even a philosopher. I am a cultural critic by education, with my main focus being psychosocial developments and culture. And my entire approach is basically psychoanthropological, and I just kind of happen to know a little bit about philosophy. And this is by no means me trying to explain some failure, okay? I'm just saying, when I talk about leftism and offer my critique, I'm talking about the psychosocial developments in culture. I'm talking about movements, patterns, transformations, and not definitions or facts. So what I mean when I say leftist is the cultural formation of what can be considered leftist thought. I am aware that there are many layers to it and that the entire thing is a spectrum. So when I use the term leftist, right, I'm not referring to a strict political classification, but to the cultural formation of what can be considered leftist, okay? So how it manifests in discourse and identity formation and social behavior and stuff like that. My critique is not about leftist politics in the conventional sense. It's about how leftist thought, politically, socially, culturally, operates within culture. So how does it structure identities? How does it shape collective narratives? Where does it reinforce or dissolve spooks? I am interested in how leftism emerges, adapts, and transforms in response to societal pressures, and how at times it becomes its own kind of normative structure. I'm not here to argue over definitions. I'm examining the cultural logic behind it. So the main issue people seem to have with my take on leftism is that it's too broad or too focused on one specific thing. So I don't know, I hope this helps. So kind of what I'm saying is I'm gonna be broad, deal with it. Thanks. Okay, now let's tackle the next one, which is modern psychology, which I must say is a topic I've absolutely been shredded to pieces about. But let me put myself back together and offer you some thoughts. The main issue people seem to have with my take on modern psychology is that my perspective does not consider the relevance of therapeutic practices like Maslow's self-actualization, or the last video, which was cognitive behavioral therapy, and that I don't get how Stirner's work actually aligns with these methods and practices. So from the view of this first critique, the focus on culture and psychosocial dynamics undermines the practical real-world applications of these therapeutic approaches, which have obviously shown to help people improve their mental health and achieve personal growth. The criticism that I get is that my approach dismisses the value of these tools in favor of some bullshit abstract theory, which implies that I don't fully acknowledge how these methods operate in a clinical setting or how they've helped individuals for like decades. But here's my defense. Therapeutic practices, while offering tangible benefits in individual cases, tend to fail to address or even acknowledge the broader systemic problems, like the pressures of capitalism that contribute to mental distress in the first place. And I don't mean they do this by practice, like they're not walking around being like, the world is great and we should all like become part of it, become a functional part of it, but by existing as a way to support the problem, doing so, sadly, by simply existing in the first place. And I am not trying to say they shouldn't exist, okay? So yeah, society exists, and yeah, people need relief and they need help and they need to be supported. I am not negating that at all whatsoever. But I am here to look at it from a psychoanthropological perspective. I'm not an anti-CBT activist. I'm not trying to change its existence. What I am seeing is people who see therapists because they feel there's something wrong with them, not people who see therapists because they feel there's something wrong with society or culture. And yes, of course, undermining the fucked upness of society isn't the point of CBT. I understand that. But it is nonetheless the result of it. So one critique that I received is that Stirner would actually likely support CBT and that his views align with it. But I gotta say, this is, in my opinion, a misunderstanding of Stirner's philosophy, which turns him into a materialist and a pragmatist, which I don't agree with. I don't think Stirner's egoism is about offering practical solutions to individual problems within a given system. Like, I'm sorry, but like not at all. I think it's about deconstructing and liberating the individual from all forms of external control, which essentially includes systems that position themselves as solutions. But also, I don't think Stirner would care if you personally found something in CBT that works for you. If you're an individual who takes something from it and it serves your needs, then for Stirner, I think he would be like, yeah, that's your right and your prerogative. The key point is that Stirner would very likely never encourage anyone to adopt CBT or any therapeutic method as an inherent or ultimate way of being, right? So whether or not his thoughts align with the methods or fundamental approaches of CBT is irrelevant ultimately. And I'm not here to talk about whether or not CBT works. Of course it does. Of course it does. A lot of smart people work on it. I'm sure there is merit to it. But I also have to say, many things could potentially work, right? But that work is irrelevant. That being able to work is irrelevant ultimately to what I am looking at, because it is individual. Whatever works for the individual. So I'm going to say it again. Cognitive behavioral therapy, like any therapeutic system, is rooted in the assumption that there's a specific way the individual, quote unquote, should function. Yes, it's an individual functionality, but it's still relying on some idea of normativity. And that is what I was talking about when I was talking about psychoanalysis versus modern psychology. I was trying to show how the suppression of psychoanalysis in society is tactical in a sense, or has been tactical in a sense, and that the establishment of modern psychology is rooted in that suppression, which ultimately rests on diverging the focus of psychology away from structural aspects of identity formation to the individual's internal processes, which are divorced from the social and cultural structures that shape them. That's why, while CBT helps individuals cope with their personal issues, it never really questions the underlying structures that produce those issues in the first place. It shifts the burden of responsibility onto the individual, and it asks them to adapt and conform to existing norms, not in practice. It's not like the therapist is saying this to the patient, but by simply existing. So, to clarify, Stirner wouldn't care if you use cognitive behavioral therapy, obviously, or any method to manage your life, but he would definitely, and I'm sorry to assume this here, but I don't know, I feel like I'm right about this, reject the notion that any therapeutic method should define or limit your existence. So Stirner's egoism is about liberation, which means to be able to define yourself independently of external frameworks. And so anything, like any idea of something like self-optimization or even quote-unquote mental health is limiting to that. So what I'm getting at with this critique is that while therapeutic practices like CBT can be incredibly useful and practical, they still function within a system that ultimately maintains the status quo. Again, not by practice, but by existence. That is all I have to say about that. I hope you enjoyed this. This is my first try, so don't go too hard. I appreciate you listening. I appreciate you giving this a chance. Let me know how you feel. Let me know what I can do. Let me know if there's anything you would like me to talk about next time. And see you next Sunday.